Well, Kiristofer, thank you very much for all that. Our next speaker is going to have her work cut out because she's speaking in favour of the motion that the Catholic Church is a force for good. The Conservative MP and former government minister, Anne Widdecombe, she's as well known for her religious views as for her politics. If you recall, she left the Church of England in 1992 in a blaze of publicity when it allowed the ordination of women priests. The following year, she converted to Catholicism and has become one of the most vocal and staunchest defenders of the Catholic Church since then. Anne Widdecombe, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Madam Chairman. If apologies are due tonight, they are due from Christopher Hitchens, who has just run through one of the longest series of misrepresentations of the Catholic Church that I have heard in a long time. It really is, I think, quite telling that in coping with a motion which says the Catholic Church is a force for good in the world, he has to go back to the Crusades in order to try and disprove it. Or if that's slightly too far back, the sack of Constantinople. He can't actually look at the force that the Catholic Church is in the world today, but I do nevertheless want to join him on his ground, though not sharing any of his conclusions, and just look at some of the things which he has stated. He has said, and actually, you know, no pope pronouncing ex cathedra could ever sound more convinced of truth than when Christopher Hitchens utters something incredibly questionable. But he has said, with that certainty which characterizes his utterances, that the Catholic Church has had a history of anti-Semitism. Let us just look at the record of the Catholic Church. When the Jewish community was under the most serious threat that it has faced in recent centuries, and just look at the role that the Catholic Church played in the last World War. Mr. Hitchens ignores the thousands of Jews who were secreted and rescued in churches and monasteries throughout Europe, at tremendous risk to the priests and the monks and the nuns who were hiding them. He ignores the 3,000 Jews who, in the course of that conflict, took refuge in the Pope's own summer palace. He contradicts flatly the statement of so many prominent Jews after 1945 who expressed gratitude to Pius XII, even to the extent of sending the Israeli Philharmonic Orchestra to stage a concert in the Pope's honour. Not, I think, something that they would have done if they had thought he had been anti-Semitic, but rather they recognised that the Catholic Church throughout that period acted within the limitations of the time as a force for good. And of course, we should remember that any Christian, not just Catholic, but any Christian joining the SS had first to renounce his faith. So I do not think that a charge of anti-Semitism can stand up. Yes, it is quite true that the New Testament says that the first century Sanhedrin made a very major contribution to the death of Christ. So also did the Romans. And indeed, it's Pontius Pilate that we remember in the Creed every Sunday, not the Sanhedrin. Yet I do not recall Mr. Hitchens suggesting that because of that, the modern Catholic Church is anti-Italian. I rather thought it was quite pro-Italian. He also suggests that the Pope welcomed back a Holocaust-denying bishop. Let us first remember that the bishop in question was originally expelled for disobedience. Upon being reinstated and upon reiterating his views, the Pope, a fact conveniently ignored by Mr. Hichens, commanded him to repent, commanded him to deny what he had said. You would think from listening to Mr. Hichens that the Catholic Church alone has been responsible for atrocities throughout history. If you are going to judge the Catholic Church at any given stage in history, then you have to judge it against the standards that were prevailing at the time, and condemning the Inquisition, which was a horrible thing, condemning the Inquisition in isolation from condemning just about the whole, in fact the whole, of European society, which at that time rejoiced in punishment and torture as a means of dealing with criminality and with treason and with wrongdoing. To try and divorce the Catholic Church from that and say that it was uniquely guilty under the Inquisition is simply trying to look back at centuries gone past and apply a standard that nobody applied at the time. And coming nearer to our day, of course, Kiristofer Hichens is right, and who could possibly dispute with him, that the abuse of children, of innocent children, is one, in fact, it is the worst offence that anybody can commit. Of that, no doubt. But again, he seems to think that the Catholic Church should have had some unique insight, which demonstrably was lacking in society as a whole, and I'll give examples at the time. Let's remember that in the 1970s, not the Crusades, not the sack of Constantinople, but in the 1970s, the National Council for Civil Liberties in this country allowed the paedophile information exchange to affiliate to it. And the National Council for Civil Liberties had extremely respectable people at its head, including Harriet Harman and Patricia Hewitt. Would anybody seriously say that they condoned child abuse? They were acting in the ignorance of the time. Magistrates at that time, some didn't even get before judges sometimes. Magistrates were awarding a few months in prison for that heinous crime. I myself, in the 1980s, trained as a Samaritan. One of the things we were taught was how to handle it when we got callers about child abuse. We were not taught then, because they didn't know, that actually there was no way that somebody who abused would simply stop. And it was only in the mid-1990s, and don't I know it because I was in the Home Office at the time, that we actually introduced in this country a register of sex offenders. Do not expect the Catholic Church somehow, when that was the state of knowledge at the time, to have acted in a unique and completely different way. In retrospect, yes, of course. In retrospect, yup. In retrospect, it should have done. So should the magistrates. So should the Samaritans. So should the National Council of Civil Liberties. But when we ask whether the Catholic Church is a force for good, let's just try to imagine a world today without, for example, the billions of pounds that are poured into overseas aid by the Catholic Church, contributing year on year more than any single nation. Imagine the developing world had been left without the input of the medicine and the education that was brought to it by the missions. Imagine the absence of those collections Sunday upon Sunday for famine relief. Imagine the absence of the church in the local community. What is the church? It is its members. It is the nuns and the monks and the priests and the lay workers and the congregations. It is not just the hierarchy of the church. And I believe that the church to which I belong is a massive, massive force for good. But let us not just keep the debate at that level. I knew somehow that when we were here tonight, we would be discussing child abuse and condoms. They came in the end. I almost thought we were going to get through an entire speech without condoms from Kiristofer Heytjens, but we got them at the end. If he has a creed, it would be, I believe in condoms. So, but that is not what the Catholic Church is about. It isn't only about the physical relief of the poor. It isn't only about the work it does on earth, but it is the message that it preaches. And that message is one of hope. That message is one of salvation. And it is all very well for some people in their intellectual arrogance to say, we can do without that. But actually, billions of people across the world live by that message of hope and of salvation. They try to live by the commandments and also by the interpretation of those commandments by Christ. Yeah, sometimes they fail. Sometimes their leaders fail. Human beings do fail. But overwhelmingly, I say to you tonight with no apology or whatever, that a world without the Catholic Church would be poorer, would be more hopeless, and would be a worse place in which to live.